She was known as the coldest CEO in Chicago, a woman who had clawed her way to the top of a billion-dollar defense technology firm before the age of 30 and had never once looked back. But when a kidnapping threat forced her out of her glass penthouse, the protection protocol didn't send her to a 5-star secured hotel. It sent her to the narrow front porch of a quiet security guard, a widower, a single father, a man who made $18 an hour watching the lobby of her own building. Alexandra Hayes called it an insult. She had no idea it would be the most important 3 weeks of her life. Stay until the end to find out why a night shift security guard made an entire corporate board bow their heads in silence. Christian Walker was 28 years old, and he looked like a man who had learned to carry his life quietly without asking anyone to notice the weight. He worked the overnight security shift at Heartwarming Dynamics, a defense technology conglomerate headquartered in downtown Chicago, clocking in at 10 in the evening and clocking out just before Sophia woke up at 6 in the morning. He had timed it perfectly. The drive home, the soft click of the front door, the way he moved through the small house without waking her. He was always there when she opened her eyes. Sophia Walker was 6 years old, bright-eyed and endlessly curious, the kind of child who asked questions about everything and drew pictures of every answer she didn't receive. She kept a worn stuffed rabbit named Biscuit tucked under her arm wherever she went, and she had an absolute certainty, one she had stated plainly many times, that her father was a secret superhero, not the loud, flashy kind, the quiet kind, the kind that didn't tell anyone. She wasn't entirely wrong. Christian's house sat in a working-class neighborhood on the outer edge of Chicago's southwest side. A 1-story brick structure with a small yard, a cracked driveway, and a detached garage in the back that he kept locked. The neighborhood was the kind of place where people waved to each other in the morning and didn't ask too many questions in the evening. It was modest, worn in the way that things get when they've been used honestly for a long time. Christian had bought it with savings from a life he no longer lived. He kept it clean. He kept the heat on in winter. He kept the refrigerator stocked. That was what mattered. What people at Heartwarming didn't know, what no one in that sleek glass tower knew, was that Christian Walker had not always been a security guard. 5 years earlier, he had been one of the most gifted systems engineers in the American defense technology sector. He had built encrypted communication architectures for government contractors, written security protocols that were still in use at 3 federal agencies, and co-founded quietly, without his name on a single public document, a cybersecurity framework that had become the backbone of more than one classified military network. He had been 23 years old. He had been brilliant. He had been on a path that most people in his field spent entire careers trying to reach. Then something happened, and then he disappeared. He never talked about it. Not to his neighbors, not to his coworkers, not to the shift supervisor who occasionally asked about his background. When Christian effortlessly reconfigured a glitching access control panel that had stumped 2 contracted IT specialists, he always gave the same small shrug. "Picked it up," he'd say. And then he went back to walking his rounds. His colleagues at Heartwarming found him odd. Polite enough, but distant. The office staff barely acknowledged him. The executives who passed through the lobby at night looked through him the way people look through furniture present, but irrelevant. He was used to it. In some ways, he had chosen it. The world he no longer belonged to, at least not officially, was the world of Heartwarming Dynamics itself. Founded 17 years ago and valued at just over $9 billion, Heartwarming was a titan of the defense and artificial intelligence sector. A company that built the kind of technology governments paid for without asking too many questions. Its Chicago headquarters occupied the top 20 floors of a polished tower on Michigan Avenue. And at the center of all of it, sitting in the largest corner office on the 43rd floor, was Alexandra Hayes. Alexandra was 27 years old. She had been appointed CEO 14 months ago, making her the youngest chief executive in the company's history. She was sharp in the way that surgical instruments are sharp, precise, cold, designed to cut through whatever stood between her and the result she needed. She did not tolerate softness. She did not tolerate delay. And she did not trust men. That last part was not a policy. It was a scar. When Alexandra was 9 years old, her father had left their family for a woman he had been seeing for 3 years. When she was 14, her mother had swallowed a handful of sleeping pills on a Tuesday evening in October and had not woken up. Alexandra had been the one who found her. She had called 911 with a voice so steady that the dispatcher had asked twice if she was sure she was only 14. She had never cried at the funeral. She had never cried about it since. She had built Helixor's future on the ruins of everything she had refused to feel. And she was very good at it. The threat came on a Wednesday. Alexandra had just left a closed-door strategy meeting, one of those sessions that didn't appear on the official calendar. Attended only by herself, the company's general counsel, and 2 members of the board. The meeting had concerned the Meridian contract, a pending military agreement that, if signed, would be the single largest defense deal in Helixor's history, worth an estimated $4.7 billion over 7 years. The negotiations had been proceeding carefully. Certain parties, it was understood, did not want the contract to be signed. She noticed the black SUV when she was 2 blocks from the tower. It was there when she turned onto Columbus Drive. It was still there when she took an unplanned detour down a side street. She had her driver circle the block. The SUV circled with them. She called the head of corporate security before she reached the parking structure. By the time she stepped out of the car, 3 things had already been set in motion. But the real damage was discovered that night. Her penthouse on the 58th floor of a North Michigan Avenue residential tower had been entered while she was at a dinner engagement. The intruder or intruders had been professionals. The building's security camera footage had been looped. The door lock had been bypassed without a single scratch. The penthouse had been left almost exactly as she had left it, with one exception. The slim black laptop from her home office was gone. It contained encrypted project files, internal communications, and a partially drafted version of the Meridian contract addendum. The kind of data that, in the wrong hands, could collapse a deal or crater a stock price in a single afternoon. The security team's assessment was delivered by 10 o'clock that evening. This was an inside job. Someone within Helixor, or with access to Helixor's internal intelligence, had enabled the breach. Alexandra could not return to her penthouse. Every address associated with her name or the corporation was a liability. It was Christian who identified the solution. He had been running a quiet analysis of the building's network logs when he noticed something. The surveillance intrusion system being used against Alexandra was actively scanning a database of addresses linked to Helixor. Every location the security team had suggested was on that list. But one address wasn't. His address. He brought the finding to the head of security, without elaborating on how he had run the analysis. The recommendation was passed up the chain. By midnight, a decision had been made. Alexandra Hayes was going to stay with Christian Walker for 3 weeks. She did not take the news with grace. She stood in the security conference room in a tailored gray blazer, arms crossed, and stared at the address on the paper in front of her, as if it had personally offended her. A residential street in the southwest suburbs, no private security detail, no dedicated communications infrastructure, a single bathroom. She had been in the building for 6 years and had never once learned the name of the night shift guard. "This is not a viable option," she said flatly. "It's the only option that isn't already compromised," the security director replied. She stared at the paper for a long time. Then she picked up her bag and walked out. 2 hours later, a black car pulled up in front of Christian Walker's house at 2:30 in the morning. He was standing on the porch when it arrived, as if he had been expecting it, which he had. He was wearing a gray Henley and holding a mug of coffee. He watched the car door open. He watched Alexandra Hayes step out into the cold air and look at his house, with the expression of someone confronting a situation entirely beneath them. He didn't say anything. He just held the door open. Inside, Sophia was asleep with Biscuit tucked under her chin. The heater in the hallway was making a faint rattling sound that Christian had been carefully managing for 2 weeks. He had already decided not to mention it. Alexandra set her bag down in the small second bedroom, looked at the narrow bed, looked at the second-hand dresser, looked at the window with its cotton curtain, and said nothing. She thought, 3 weeks. I can survive 3 weeks. She had no idea what 3 weeks was going to cost her. The first morning was a study in controlled hostility. Alexandra woke at 5:45, as she always did, and emerged from the second bedroom in a silk sleep shirt, and the expression of someone who had slept badly and intended for everyone to know it. Christian was already in the kitchen, making breakfast. There were scrambled eggs on the stove, a pot of coffee on the counter, and Sophia at the table in her pajamas, earnestly explaining to Biscuit what pancakes were made of. Alexandra looked at the kitchen, small, clean, slightly cramped, and then at the man standing at the stove in a worn flannel shirt, and then at the 6-year-old, who was now looking at her with unfiltered curiosity. "Are you the Ice Princess?" Sophia asked. Christian didn't turn around, but the set of his shoulders shifted slightly. "I work at your father's company," Alexandra said. Sophia considered this. "Daddy says people at that company are very tired." Alexandra poured herself coffee and did not respond. The days that followed established a pattern of friction that was, in most respects, entirely one-sided. Alexandra had rules about noise levels, about shared spaces, about what time the lights went out. She communicated these rules with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to a staff that complied without question. Christian acknowledged them with a calm that she found, if she was being honest with herself, slightly maddening. He didn't argue. He didn't push back. He adjusted, problem solved, and moved on. What she could articulate, if only to herself, late at night, were the things she kept noticing that didn't fit. On the second day, she watched him repair a section of the house's electrical panel that had been causing intermittent outages. He worked without a manual, without looking anything up, and with the kind of calm precision that she associated with engineers who had been doing something for a very long time. He was finished in 40 minutes. The 2 electricians who had looked at the same panel 3 months earlier had spent an afternoon and solved nothing. On the third day, she was reviewing an encrypted data file on her laptop, a fragment of the compromised document cache that the security team had partially recovered, when she happened to glance up and see Christian at the kitchen table, waiting for Sophia to finish her drawing. He was looking at the file reflected in the glass of the window behind her. She watched his eyes move. She watched him read it, not glance at it, read it, line by line. She closed the laptop. He looked back at Sophia's drawing. Neither of them said anything. On the 4th day, the security system on the exterior of the house emitted a faint burst of static interference that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Alexandra registered it as noise. Christian was out of the back door in under 30 seconds, scanning the perimeter with the kind of systematic calm that had everything to do with training and nothing to do with instinct. He reset one of the sensors, updated a setting on his phone, and poured himself a glass of water. "What was that?" Alexandra asked. "Old sensor," he said. "Fixed it." But it was Sophia who began to crack something open in her that no data anomaly could. The little girl had decided, with the absolute certainty of a 6-year-old who had already made up her mind, that Alexandra was her friend. She brought her drawings to show. She saved her the last pancake on Saturday morning. She asked her why she didn't smile, a question Alexandra had not been asked since she was a child herself. She drew a portrait of Alexandra with long silver hair and a crown, labeling it the Ice Princess who is actually nice inside. Alexandra stared at that drawing for a long time. Late on the 5th night, she was working at the kitchen table at midnight when she noticed that the couch in the living room was occupied. Christian was asleep there, fully dressed, shoes off, an old quilt pulled to his waist. He had given her the second bedroom, given Sophia the main bedroom, and taken the couch without mentioning it, without asking for acknowledgement. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. His hands rested on the edge of the quilt. She could see the calluses across his palms, the faint scar along his right knuckle. His jacket hung over the back of the couch, its cuffs worn thin at the edges. His laptop was open on the coffee table, screen dimmed to low brightness. She walked closer and looked at what was on the screen. It was a network architecture diagram. Dense, layered, annotated in a shorthand. She recognized from her own company's most classified technical documents. Beside it, a security algorithm with a methodology that surpassed anything currently in Helixor's development pipeline. She stepped back. She stood very still. She told herself there was an explanation. She was not yet ready to consider what that explanation might be. She found it on the 7th night. She had been lying awake, listening to the wind push against the window frame, when she heard the soft sound of the back door opening and closing. After 15 minutes, she got up. The garage sat at the far end of the backyard, separated from the house by a stretch of dead grass and a concrete path. Light leaked from beneath its door. She crossed the yard in her coat and pushed the door open. What she found inside was not a garage. The space had been cleared of everything a garage was supposed to contain. What filled it instead were 4 server towers arranged against the far wall, humming quietly in the cold air, their cable management precise in the way that only someone with deep technical knowledge would bother to maintain. 3 monitors sat on a long work table of raw lumber and sawhorses, each showing different data streams. Handmade circuit boards were mounted along the left wall in neat rows, labeled in a small, careful hand. Printed schematics were pinned above the monitors, dense enough to read less like technical drawings and more like maps of some invisible world. And at the center of it all, Christian Walker sat on a plain wooden stool, working. He heard her come in. He didn't move for a moment. Then he turned. Neither of them spoke. The servers hummed. Outside, the wind shifted. "You shouldn't be out here," he said finally. His voice was even, unshocked. "What is this?" Alexandra said. He looked at the room around him as if he were considering how to answer a question he had already answered many times in his own head. "A project," he said. She walked to the work table and looked at the monitors. The data on the center screen was structured in a way she had seen only once before, in a confidential internal report she had read during her first month as CEO, a report about a cybersecurity infrastructure project that Helixor had quietly shut down 5 years earlier. The project had been described in 2 sentences. Its scope, the report implied, had been extraordinary. Its cancellation had been presented as a budget decision. She looked at the schematics above the monitors. She looked at the circuit boards. She looked at the algorithm structure on the left screen, which was not half constructed as she had seen on his laptop. It was nearly complete. And it was, without any hyperbole she could locate in herself, one of the most elegant pieces of security architecture she had ever encountered. She turned back to him. "You built the Aegis framework," she said. The silence that followed was the kind that confirms something rather than obscures it. Aegis had been a ghost in Helixor's internal mythology, a classified cybersecurity project from the company's early years, credited to no one, referenced only in redacted documents. Security professionals, who knew anything about it, spoke of a zero-intrusion network architecture capable of predicting breach attempts before they occurred. It had apparently been abandoned before completion, except it hadn't been abandoned. It had been taken. Christian turned back to his monitors. "It's not finished," he said. "You were the co-founder," Alexandra said. Not a question. He was quiet for a moment. "I was a contractor," he said. "That's the version on record." She looked at him in the cold light of the garage, this man who carried groceries and walked her company's lobby and slept on a narrow couch with worn-out cuffs on his jacket, and felt something shift in the architecture of her certainty. The story she had assembled about who Christian Walker was had just been revealed as a story about someone else entirely. "Why are you still building it?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. He turned one of the monitors slightly, adjusting the angle. And then he said, "Because it's not done." She stood there for another moment. Then she walked back to the house, without another word. In the second bedroom, she lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. The pieces she had collected over the past week, the electrical panel, the encrypted data, the sensor alert, the network diagram rearranged themselves in her mind into a shape she did not want to look at directly. Because if Christian Walker was who the evidence suggested he was, then the story of Helixor Dynamics was not the story she had been told. And if that story was wrong, everything she had built her authority upon was standing on someone else's erased name. She spent the next 2 days investigating. Not openly, she had learned, years ago, that the most important inquiries were the ones conducted in silence. She worked from her laptop during the hours when Sophia was at school, and Christian was asleep, accessing archived records, internal communications from before her time at the company, and redacted legal documents she had enough clearance to partially reconstruct. 5 years ago, Christian Walker had submitted a formal internal complaint to Helixor Dynamics Ethics Board. The complaint alleged that a senior executive had authorized the sale of proprietary security data built on the Aegis framework, to a third-party foreign technology firm under the cover of a subsidiary transaction. He had provided technical documentation. He had provided financial trace evidence. He had named names. The Ethics Board had found no substantiated violations. Within 30 days, Christian had been publicly identified through a series of industry press leaks that were never traced to their source as the primary suspect in an internal data breach. His access credentials had been flagged. His contractor agreement had been terminated. A formal investigation that lasted 4 months found, ultimately, that no criminal conduct had occurred, but the damage was irreversible. His name had appeared in 3 major technology publications under headlines that implied guilt without stating it. The kind of headlines that follow a person. He had disappeared from the industry entirely after that. Then, 8 months after the investigation closed, his wife, Emma Walker, age 26, had died in a single-car collision on a stretch of highway outside Joliet on a clear November night. The accident report cited road conditions. There had been no witnesses. The case had been closed within 2 weeks. Alexandra sat for a long time with that information. Christian believed it had not been an accident. She could find nothing in the official record to support that belief, but she could find nothing to definitively contradict it either. And she had learned, running a company full of intelligent people, that the absence of evidence and the absence of wrongdoing were not the same thing. She closed her laptop and looked out the kitchen window at the garage. That evening, Sophia came home from school with her backpack and her rabbit, and a rolled-up piece of paper that she unrolled on the kitchen table with great ceremony. It was a drawing. Christian was in it, rendered in purple crayon with a long cape and a star on his chest. He was standing in front of what appeared to be a large shadow shaped like a monster. His cape was blowing sideways. He was not looking at the monster. He was looking straight ahead. "That's Daddy," Sophia said. "I can see that," Alexandra said. "He fights the dark things," Sophia explained, very seriously. "But he does it the quiet way. He told me, people who are really good don't have to tell anyone how good they are." She smoothed a crinkle in the paper. "He says the best kind of strong is the kind nobody sees." Alexandra looked at the drawing. She looked at the purple crayon cape. She thought about a 23-year-old engineer who had built something extraordinary, had tried to do the right thing, and had spent 5 years sleeping on a couch and walking a lobby at night, and building the same thing again in a cold garage. Alone, without telling anyone. She thought about her mother's empty bedroom. She thought about her father's voice on the phone when she was 15, explaining that he had a new family now, and that she would understand when she was older. She thought about every wall she had ever built, and why she had built them, and what exactly they had kept out versus what they had kept in. She helped Sophia tape the drawing to the refrigerator. She poured 2 glasses of juice. She sat at the table and did not look away from the crayon superhero on the door. She stayed there long after Sophia went to bed. There was no single moment when it changed. It was the accumulation of ordinary things. She watched him move through the routines of his life, the morning drop-off at Sophia's school, the quiet repairs around the house, the way he stopped to talk to the elderly neighbor across the street, who never seemed to have many visitors. He fixed the tire on a young woman's bicycle at the end of the driveway one Saturday afternoon, then went back inside without looking for anyone to notice. He simply saw something that needed doing and did it. Alexandra Hayes had spent years surrounded by men who were very interested in being perceived as good. Christian Walker was the first man she had observed who seemed genuinely indifferent to that perception. He was not performing. He was not waiting for acknowledgement. He was just living simply, without theater. It was the most disarming thing she had ever encountered. The night everything became undeniable was a Thursday in the second week. A late winter storm rolled in off the lake and knocked out power to the neighborhood at 8:30. The house went dark. Sophia declared it a camping situation and went to find the flashlights. Christian lit 3 candles from a kitchen drawer and set them on the coffee table. Alexandra told herself she was fine. She stood in the hallway with her arms crossed and told herself that the tightness in her chest was merely the inconvenience of lost connectivity. It was not. When she was 12, the power had gone out during a storm, and her mother had sat in the kitchen in the dark for 6 hours without speaking. Alexandra had sat across from her and tried very hard to make herself small enough that whatever her mother was carrying wouldn't crush them both. She had never told anyone about that night, but it came back in the dark. Christian was beside her before she realized he had moved. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't reach for her. He just sat down on the floor of the hallway with his back against the wall, and after a moment she slid down beside him, and they sat in the candlelight with Sophia asleep on the couch, and he said quietly, "You don't have to explain it." She didn't. She cried not dramatically, not the way people cry in films, but the way people cry when they have held something in the chest for so long that the container finally fails. Quietly, for about 2 minutes, with her knees pulled up and her face turned slightly away from him. He didn't move closer. He didn't say anything encouraging. He just stayed. When she was done, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at him in the candlelight. "My mother died when I was 14, she said. "I know," he said. Not in a way that was intrusive, in a way that meant, "I looked you up. I knew your history before you arrived." She thought about that. She thought about the fact that he had known, and had never used it, had never leveraged it, had never once deployed her vulnerability as a tool. She was alone, Alexandra said. And she decided that was permanent. He nodded. He didn't reach for a silver lining. "Sophia thinks you're a superhero," she said after a while. "Sophia is 6, he said. A corner of his mouth moved. It was the first time she had seen him come close to smiling. It was a small thing, that almost smile. It changed the whole room. Later that night, the power came back. Sophia woke up just long enough to announce that the camping was over, and returned to bed. Christian blew out the candles. Alexandra stood in the restored light and looked at him across the living room, and she did not feel like a CEO, and she did not feel like a woman who didn't trust anyone. She felt like a person who was standing very close to something she had not believed existed. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. The threat became real again on the 11th day. Christian had been monitoring the network intrusion activity from his garage system quietly, without informing the company's security apparatus, whose channels he had determined were not entirely clean. What he had assembled over the past 2 weeks was a picture built from dozens of small data points, something far larger than a kidnapping threat. The surveillance operation against Alexandra was not designed to abduct her. It was designed to destabilize her. Someone was trying to ensure that the Meridian contract did not get signed, not by eliminating Alexandra, but by creating enough chaos around her leadership to trigger a board-level confidence review. Leaked data, a compromised CEO, a company in crisis. The narrative was already half-written. The goal was to force a temporary management transition, during which a specific board faction would push through a technology licensing deal, transferring Helixor's most sensitive AI development assets to a competitor at a fraction of their value. The man behind it was Dominic Pierce. Pierce was 44, the company's chief financial officer, and had been at Helixor since its founding. He wore expensive suits, with the ease of a man who had long ago decided that appearance was authority. He was charming at board meetings, measured in interviews, and regarded by most of the company's investor class as a stabilizing institutional presence. He was trusted. He was also, Christian had now documented with quiet certainty, the same man who had orchestrated the internal campaign against him 5 years earlier. It was Pierce who had leaked Christian's name to the press, arranged the ethics board's findings, and authorized the original data transfer that Christian had attempted to expose. The subsidiary transaction Christian had flagged had generated $11 million in off-book proceeds, structured into a private investment vehicle that Pierce controlled through a series of shell companies. Christian had known this for years. He had been building the evidentiary record for years, but he had never moved on it. Because of Sophia, when he told Alexandra standing in the garage on the 11th night, the servers humming around them, she was very quiet for a long time. "You've had this evidence for years," she said. "Not all of it. Enough. And you did nothing." He looked at her. "I have a 6-year-old daughter, whose mother is buried in a cemetery in Joliet. Doing something has a cost. I wasn't willing to pay it in someone else's currency." Alexandra stood in the cold light of the garage. "If you stay quiet, and Pierce keeps moving, he destroys the Meridian contract. He sells our technology to a competitor. He does to this company what he did to you, and this time it's 4,000 employees." "I know," Christian said. "And if you move, and something goes wrong—" "I know," he said again. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything neither of them were saying. "You don't have to be in it," he said. "I'm already in it," she said. "I've been in it since the penthouse." They began working together that night. The days that followed were the most frightening and most clarifying of Alexandra's life. Christian used his monitoring system to trace the financial threads in real time, feeding data to Alexandra, who cross-referenced it against Helixor's internal systems using her CEO credentials. They communicated in short, careful exchanges, no company channels, no personal phones. On the 13th night, a car followed Christian home from his shift. He lost it by a different route, and said nothing to Alexandra until morning. On the 14th night, Pierce's operatives made their real move. Sophia had been walked home from school by a neighbor, as she was twice a week when Christian's schedule overlapped with afternoon dismissal. The neighbor was a retired teacher named Mrs. Calloway, who lived 2 houses down and had been walking Sophia home for 8 months. That afternoon, Mrs. Calloway did not arrive at the school. A different car was there instead. Sophia did not get in. She went back inside and told her teacher. Her teacher called the number on Sophia's emergency card. Christian's phone rang at 3:27 in the afternoon. What happened over the next 4 hours was something Alexandra would not fully process for weeks afterward. Christian moved with a concentrated precision that was nothing like fear and nothing like anger. It was colder than either of those things. He traced the vehicle registration. He pulled cell tower data from a hotspot device he kept for exactly this kind of contingency. He located a probable position within 19 minutes and had it confirmed within 35. Alexandra was already behind the wheel when he came out of the house. He looked at her for 1 second. He got in. The location was a decommissioned warehouse near the river, 11 miles southwest. They arrived in the rain, in the dark, at 10 minutes past 7. Christian went in alone. He was inside for 22 minutes. When he came out, He was carrying Sophia, who had biscuit clutched to her chest and was explaining, with mild irritation, that the men inside had not let her finish her drawing. Alexandra stood in the rain with her heart still pounding, and watched a man who had just walked through a building full of people who wanted something from him emerge with nothing but his daughter, and the absolute intention never to let anything take her from him. She understood something then, standing in the rain, something about what love actually looked like when it had been stripped of performance and vanity and need. It was this. It was a man walking out of a dark building with a little girl and a stuffed rabbit, perfectly calm, because there had never been any other outcome he was willing to consider. The Meridian signing was scheduled for a Friday. The boardroom on the 43rd floor had been prepared with the kind of theatrical precision reserved for moments meant to be photographed and remembered. There were flags, name placards, 3 generals from the Pentagon's acquisition office, 2 representatives from the Department of Defense, 7 board members, 4 major institutional investors, and a cluster of credentialed journalists. The signing was to be the defining moment of Alexandra's tenure, proof that the youngest CEO in the company's history had delivered exactly what she had promised. Dominic Pierce arrived 20 minutes early, as he always did at events he intended to control. He was impeccably dressed. He shook hands. He smiled at the generals. He positioned himself 3 chairs to the left of the head of the table, where the cameras would catch his reaction at the moment of greatest significance. He had a package-fabricated documentation, carefully constructed, that would establish Christian Walker as an unauthorized system intruder who had accessed Helixor's networks on multiple occasions over the past 3 weeks. The evidence would be presented during the signing ceremony, framed as a security disclosure. Alexandra would be forced to respond publicly. Her fitness to sign a $4.7 billion contract would become suddenly, lethally visible. Pierce had done this kind of thing before. The meeting opened at 9 o'clock. Alexandra entered the room alone. She was dressed in her usual black, sharp, composed, the same externally contained presence she had always been. She took her seat at the head of the table. She thanked the attendees. She said the things that needed to be said about the Meridian contract, about Helixor's mission, about the value of the partnership being formalized that morning. Then Dominic Pierce raised his hand. He presented his evidence package with the ease of a man who had rehearsed this moment. He spoke about security protocols. He spoke about breach events. He spoke about a former employee. He used the word former carefully, as if it carried its own verdict, who had been accessing proprietary systems without authorization. He spoke with measured concern, the kind of concern that performs itself as reluctant duty. He looked, throughout, like a man who was sorry to have to do this. He proposed that, given the security disclosure, the signing be postponed pending an internal review. He looked at the board. He looked at the generals. He looked at Alexandra with something just behind his eyes that was almost satisfaction. Alexandra let him finish. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up. "Thank you, Dominic," she said. "I'd like to respond." She did not reach for a document. She did not pull up a slide. She simply spoke, clearly and directly, with the precision of someone who had spent 14 months learning the exact center of every pressure point in the room. She told them what Dominic Pierce had done 5 years ago. She told them about the data sale, the ethics board finding that had been arranged rather than reached, the $11 million in off-book proceeds structured through a private investment vehicle she named by its registered entity designation. She told them about Christian Walker's complaint, his public destruction, and the 5 years he had spent as a night shift security guard in a building that Pierce helped build on his stolen work. She told them about the threat against her. She told them about Sophia. Pierce interrupted twice. Each time, Alexandra continued. Then the door at the back of the boardroom opened, and Christian Walker walked in. He was not wearing a suit. He was wearing the same plain dark jacket he always wore, the one with the worn cuffs. He carried a hard drive, a small, black, unremarkable rectangle, which he connected to the room's presentation system without asking anyone's permission. The screen at the front of the room filled with data, 5 years of records, transaction logs, communication transcripts, financial flows, timestamps, server access records that Pierce's team had believed were unrecoverable, evidentiary threads that connected, cleanly and without ambiguity, to every illegal action that had been taken and to the man who had taken them. The room was silent. Christian did not explain the data at length. He stood beside the screen and let the records speak in the language that defense contractors and institutional investors and generals all understood perfectly, the language of documented fact. Pierce stood up. He said something about authentication. He said something about admissibility. He looked around the room for the alliance he had been building for years, and found that none of the faces looking back at him were the faces of allies. He pushed back his chair. Christian stepped into the space between him and the door. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't raise his voice. He stood in front of Dominic Pierce and looked at him with an expression that was entirely calm. The kind of calm that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from the absolute security of knowing you are standing exactly where you should be. "You took everything from me," Christian said. His voice was quiet. The room was very still. "My work, my name, my wife's life, 5 years of my daughter's father." He paused. "But you couldn't take the evidence. And you couldn't take who I am." 2 FBI agents entered through the side door. They had been in the building since 7 that morning. Dominic Pierce was escorted out of Helixor Dynamics in front of his generals and his investors and his journalists, his hands behind his back, his expensive suit irrelevant now. His face, the face of a man who had spent years calculating everything, except this. The room remained silent for a long moment. Alexandra looked at Christian Walker standing in the place where Pierce had been, perfectly still, completely calm. She called the meeting back to order. At 10:47 that morning, the Meridian contract was signed. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Helixor Dynamics had experienced in its 17-year history. Pierce's arrest triggered regulatory inquiries, a voluntary cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors, and a complete financial audit going back 8 years. 3 other senior executives resigned. The board held an emergency session that lasted 11 hours. Alexandra sat at the center of all of it, steady as a fixed point, doing what she had always been best at, moving forward. The board's first proposal, issued within 48 hours of the signing, was that Christian Walker be offered the position of Chief Technology Officer. Full executive compensation, equity, the title and the authority and the public recognition he had never received. The vote was unanimous. He declined. He called Alexandra from outside Sophia's school, standing on the sidewalk in the cold morning air, and said it simply, "No." She drove to see him. "Why?" she asked. Standing in the kitchen of the small house with the cotton curtains. "You built that company's security infrastructure. You spent 5 years being erased. They're trying to give you what you should have had from the beginning." He was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window. "Sophia doesn't need a CTO for a father," he said. "She needs the father she already has, the one who's there in the morning, the one who walks her to school. I was that other version of myself once. It cost me everything I cared about. I won't do that to her." Alexandra looked at him for a long time. She had run a company for 14 months by optimizing every variable, making every decision based on outcome and return. Standing in Christian Walker's kitchen, she understood that this was the last wall she had left. She told him what she had found in Helixor's system logs. 47 instances over 3 years, anonymous network alerts, vulnerability patches submitted through obscured channels, each one catching a breach attempt before it materialized. She had traced them all to the same routing signature, Christian's. He had been protecting Helixor from the outside, even as the company went on not knowing his name. "You saved us," she said. "While we were ignoring you." He didn't say anything. "Why?" she asked. "Because the people in that building didn't do anything to me," he said. "Pierce did. They're not the same thing." She had no response to that. It was perhaps the most precise moral distinction she had ever heard, stated that simply. She took a breath. "I'd like to offer you something else. Independent security consultant. You set your own hours. You work from wherever you choose. You answer to no one but me, and only on projects you agree to take." She paused, "And Sophia's school whatever she needs, for as long as she needs it." He was quiet for a moment. "That last part isn't negotiable," she said. A corner of his mouth moved. "No," he agreed. The arrangement was formalized within a week. Sophia got a new bedroom, painted yellow at her request, with a full wall designated for drawings. She covered it within the first month. Biscuit was given a small custom shelf in the corner. Months passed. Helixor was restructured root to branch. The Meridian contract entered its implementation phase. Alexandra made changes she had been wanting to make since her first week. As CEO changes she had been too isolated. She now understood, to see clearly enough to execute. On a Saturday afternoon in late spring, Sophia handed her a new drawing. It was the three of them, Christian on the left, Alexandra on the right. Sophia in the middle, holding both their hands. There were no capes in this one, no monsters, no shadows, just three people standing in the light, rendered in the confident and entirely inaccurate proportions of a 6-year-old who understood, at her age, more about the structure of a real family than most adults manage to learn in a lifetime. Across the top of the page, in large and careful letters, "Family is where nobody has to pretend to be strong." Christian looked at it for a long moment. Alexandra looked at him, looking at it. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed saying. What makes a story like this one endure is not the plot mechanics, though the mechanics here are deliberate and well constructed. It is something older and more persistent. The satisfaction of watching someone who was made small be restored to their true size, and watching someone who was made hard be restored to their true capacity for feeling. The audience this story reaches most deeply is not searching for romantic excitement alone. It is the audience of people who have spent a significant portion of their lives being underestimated or who have underestimated themselves. The people who have swallowed their accomplishments to survive an impossible situation. The people who have built their cold competence as a wall against something they were never supposed to have to withstand. The people who watched someone they trusted take credit for what they created and had no recourse and kept going anyway. Christian Walker works as a character because he is not trying to win. He is not trying to be seen. He is not performing his virtue or his intelligence for an audience. He is simply doing what needs to be done, in the only way he knows how, without expectation of recognition. There is a particular hunger in audiences, especially those who came of age in a culture that rewards loud self-promotion for exactly this kind of character. The quiet man who is genuinely good, genuinely capable, and genuinely indifferent to whether or not anyone notices. Alexandra Hayes works as a character, not because she is sympathetic from the beginning. She is not, but because her coldness is explained without being excused. Audiences don't hate her. They understand her. They have, many of them, been her. The person who decided that needing nothing was safer than needing something that could be taken away. Her transformation is not that of a person who was wrong about the world. It is the transformation of a person who was right about the danger and wrong about the remedy. Sophia serves a function that no adult character can serve. She has no defenses. She says what she sees, draws what she feels, asks the questions the adults are too armored to ask. The line she contributes about people who are really good not needing to tell anyone is more than a character moment. It is the story's thesis, delivered by the only person in the house who has not yet learned to be complicated about the truth. The conspiracy framework gives the narrative its external momentum, But what holds the attention is the internal tension. Two people circling the possibility of trusting each other, neither of them sure they remember how. The external plot gives them a reason to be together. The internal story is why anyone stays. The boardroom scene works because it delivers something audiences rarely receive in clean public form. The moment when the person who did the right thing, and was punished for it, is vindicated in front of everyone who watched the punishment and said nothing. It is not revenge. Christian makes that clear with the only words he speaks directly to Pierce. It is something quieter and more permanent, the restoration of the record. Stories that persist give people something they are not getting elsewhere. Not comfort. Comfort is cheap. Not excitement. Excitement is everywhere. What persists is recognition. The story that says, without apology, that the quiet person in the room may be the most important one, that love is not a performance of grand gestures, but a daily decision to remain, and that the families we build from our own choices are the ones most worth keeping. That is what this story says. That is why it endures. End of script.